The schoolroom had no door. That was the first thing anyone noticed who came down the lane past the old miller's cottage at Ashfen. Where a door should have been, there was a length of brown wool hung on a nail, heavy enough to keep out the wind, but thin enough that on cold mornings the children's breath showed on the air inside the room the same as it showed on the air outside. There were 12 of them on most days, sometimes 14. Once, in a wet November, there had been 17, because the farms flooded and the children could not be put to work in the fields, and their mothers sent them somewhere dry. The table was a door laid across 2 barrels. The benches were planks. The books were 4, and all 4 had been mended so many times with strips of cloth and paste that the original covers were barely visible under the repair work. The girl who taught in that room sat at the head of the door table each morning at 7 and did not rise until the last child had gone home in the afternoon. She was not paid. She had never been paid. She had simply begun one autumn when she was 19, the year after her father died, and left her the cottage and nothing else, and she had gone on beginning every morning since, without once asking who was going to pay her for it. Her name was Clara Ashworth, and she was 26 years old, and she had calloused fingertips from chalking letters on the single square of dark slate she used as a board, and she had a straight back and quiet eyes, the color of winter water, and she had not, in 7 years of this work, been given so much as a word of formal thanks by anyone with the power to give it. That was the shape of her life, and she had made her peace with the shape. And if on the very worst mornings she sat for a moment longer than usual, in the cold, before she hung the wool curtain back and let the first child in, nobody saw her do it, and nobody knew. The village of Ashfen sat in the fold of 2 hills in the north of the county, 6 miles from the market town of Marron and 11 from the great house of Dunmore, which stood on its own hill above the river, and which most people in Ashfen had seen only from a distance, the way you see a weather system that has not yet reached you. The family was older. The present Duke of Dunmore was 31 years old and had held the title for 4 years, since his father died of a sudden illness that the county had not been warned to expect. He had come into the dukedom the way a man comes into a cold room in winter, all at once, with no preparation for the temperature. People who met him said he was quiet. People who did not meet him said he was cold. He attended Parliament when Parliament required him, and he managed the estate with a thoroughness that his steward called unusual in a man of his age, and he did not, as far as anyone could observe, enjoy anything in particular. He had not married. There had been no reason given for this that anyone could point to. He had simply not married, the way a man does not walk through a door that he has not decided to walk through. The county left him largely alone on the subject, because he was the kind of man that counties leave alone on subjects. They watched, and they waited, and they made their assumptions, and they kept those assumptions mostly to themselves, because the Duke of Dunmore had a way of looking at a person that made assumptions feel impolite. None of this was known to Clara Ashworth in any particular way. She knew he existed. She knew the estate existed. She knew that Dunmore land began 3 fields east of the village and ran for more miles in that direction than she had ever had occasion to walk. She knew his name, which was Edward. She had never seen his face. What she knew most about him, in the practical sense, was that the Dunmore estate leased the old miller's cottage to the parish for a nominal rent that had not changed in 30 years, and that it was in that cottage that she taught, and that nobody from Dunmore had ever come to look at the cottage, or ask what it was being used for, or suggest that the rent ought to be raised. She had been grateful for that in the abstract, grateful in the way you are grateful for weather that does not make itself your enemy. She had not thought much further than that. In the autumn of the 7th year, 2 things happened within the space of a single week that changed the shape of Clara Ashworth's life so completely that she would look back on the week afterward the way you look back on the turn of a road, understanding only after you have passed it that everything was different on the other side. The first was a letter. It came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the Marron postboy who rode out to the villages twice a week and always left the letters on the sill of the Ashfen Inn, because nobody had ever arranged anything more formal than that. The letter was addressed to Miss C. Ashworth in a clerk's careful hand, and it was from a firm of solicitors in Marron, and it said in its careful legal language that the lease on the miller's cottage at Ashfen had been reviewed, and that the parish was hereby notified that the rent on the said cottage would be raised, effective the 1st of the new year, to a figure that was 4 times what it had been, and that if the parish could not meet the new figure, the cottage would revert to the estate. Clara read the letter twice at the door-table, with the wool curtains still down because the children had not arrived yet. Then she read it a 3rd time, slowly, in case she had misread the figure. She had not misread it. She folded the letter along its original crease and put it in the pocket of her apron, and stood for a moment with her hand on the folded letter and her eyes on the empty room, the benches, the 4 mended books, the square of dark slate with yesterday's letters still visible on it, half erased. She was not, she told herself, going to be distressed about this before she had thought about it carefully, because distress was not useful, and she had learned a long time ago that the only thing that was ever useful was the next thing that could be done. So she thought about it carefully. The parish had no money for 4 times the rent, that was certain. The vicar, Mr. Lomas, was a kind man with a large family and a small living, and he had for 7 years expressed his admiration for Clara's work in terms that were warm and frequent, and had never included the word money. The village had no fund for such things. The farmers who sent their children to her schoolroom were not poor men, but they were not rich ones either, and they paid their children's fees to her in the form of eggs and flour and wood for the fire, and none of that could be converted into 4 times the rent by the 1st of the year. She thought about it all morning while she taught the children their letters. She thought about it while she walked home in the afternoon. She thought about it that evening, sitting by her own small fire with the letter unfolded on her knee, and when she was done thinking about it, she had arrived at the only conclusion the thinking would support, which was that she would go to Dunmore herself and ask to speak to whoever managed the estate's accounts, and she would explain what the schoolroom was and what it did, and ask whether the figure in the letter was a final one or whether there was any room to discuss it. This was not an easy conclusion to arrive at. Clara Ashworth was not a timid woman, but she was a proud one, and going to a great house to ask for a favor was the sort of thing that pride makes difficult in exact proportion to how necessary it is. She folded the letter again and put it back in her pocket, and went to bed, and did not sleep well. She went to Dunmore on Thursday. She wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool, and had been her mother's, and had been altered twice. She walked the 3 miles from Ashfen to the estate gate, because she had no horse and no money for the carrier's cart. The gate was iron, and very tall, and stood open, which she had not expected, and beyond it, the drive ran straight for half a mile between old limes before it curved out of sight toward the house. She walked the drive in the thin October light, with her letter in her pocket and her hands folded in front of her, and she did not look to either side, because she had found over the years that when you are about to do something that frightens you, it is better not to look at anything that might make it seem larger than it already is. She was shown in at the side door by a young footman who did not seem to know what to make of her, and took her name and her purpose, which she stated plainly as business regarding the miller's cottage in Ashford, and left her in a small waiting room that contained a chair and a painting of a horse, and nothing else. She waited 20 minutes. Then the door opened. The man who came in was not the steward. She knew that immediately, not from anything about his clothes, which were plain and dark, and said nothing in particular, but from the way he came into the room, which was the way a man enters a room that belongs to him without needing to announce the fact. He was tall, with a still, careful face and dark eyes that took her in quickly and without any change of expression. He was perhaps 30. He was, she would understand a moment later, the Duke. He sat down in the chair across from her, which was the only other chair in the room, as though this were entirely ordinary, and he looked at her and said in a voice that was low and even and not unkind, "You have come about the cottage in Ashford." He said it as though he already knew. She said yes. And then, because she was a woman who had learned that the clearest path between 2 points is a straight line, she took the letter from her pocket and laid it on the table between them, and she told him exactly what the cottage was used for, and had been used for 7 years, and what would happen to the children of Ashford if the rent rose to the figure named in the letter and the schoolroom closed. She did not ask for anything yet. She simply told him she had learned that people who are about to be asked for something are more likely to give it if they understand first what the something is for. He listened. He did not interrupt her. He did not look at the letter. He looked at her in the steady, considered way that she would come to know very well in the months that followed, and he let her speak until she was finished. When she was finished, there was a silence of perhaps 10 seconds, which is a long time in a small room with a stranger. Then he said, "The letter was a clerical error." She looked at him. He said it again, quietly and without any particular emphasis. "The letter was a clerical error. The rent on the cottage will not change. I am sorry you were troubled by it." She sat with this for a moment. She said, "I should like that in writing, if it is all the same to you." And something shifted in his face that was not a smile and was not far from one, and he said, "Of course," and rose to get paper, and she watched him write the correction in his own hand, and he signed it and gave it to her, and she folded it and put it in her pocket beside the first letter, and she thanked him and rose to leave. She was at the door when he said, "Miss Ashworth." She turned. He said, "How many children are there in the schoolroom at Ashford?" She said, 12 on most days, sometimes more. He nodded once, as though she had confirmed something. She went home. She told herself on the walk back that it was simply a clerical error, as he had said, and that the matter was settled, and that she need not think about it further. She thought about it the whole way home. The second thing that happened that week was smaller, and would have seemed to anyone watching it to be nothing at all. On the Saturday morning, a cart came down the lane past the miller's cottage and stopped at the door. The man driving it was from Marin, and he had in the cart 6 new books, properly bound, and a piece of dark slate large enough to cover half a wall, cut to fit a frame that had also been provided, and a small cast-iron stove with enough coal to run it for a month. He said he had a delivery for the schoolroom at Ashford. He said he had been paid. He did not say by whom. Clara stood in the lane in her apron and looked at the cart, and then at the man, and then back at the cart. She said, "Are you certain this is the right address?" He showed her the paper. It said the schoolroom at Ashford in a clerk's hand, and it had her name below it. And below her name, it said only that these items were a gift for the schoolroom, and that no acknowledgement was necessary or expected. She helped the man carry the stove inside, and watched him set it up, and then she hung the new slate on the wall where the old small one had been, and she set the 6 new books on the door table and looked at them for a long time in the quiet of the empty room, and she knew and did not know. And she thought about a tall man with a still face who had listened to her speak for 4 minutes and had written a correction in his own hand and had not smiled, and she decided very deliberately not to form any conclusions about any of it, because conclusions drawn without evidence were only feelings wearing reasonable clothing, and she was not a woman who could afford to have feelings of that particular kind about a duke. She opened the first of the new books and read the first page, and it was very good, and she set it down, and she taught the children with it on Monday and watched their faces, and that was enough. It was enough for 4 more months. In February, a woman from the estate named Mrs. Carr came to Ashfen. She was the wife of the Dunmore head gardener, a practical woman in a good wool coat, who came on a Tuesday when the children were in the schoolroom and sat in the back for an hour and watched Clara teach. She did not introduce herself until after the children had gone home. Then she said she had been sent to look at the schoolroom and report on whether there was anything it needed. Clara said she had been sent by whom? Mrs. Carr said, by the estate, which Clara understood to mean the Duke, and which told her no more than she already suspected, and no less. She showed Mrs. Carr the room. She showed her the benches, which were still planks because planks served, and the stove, which had been a great improvement, and the slate, which the children had been using beautifully. Mrs. Carr wrote things in a small book. She thanked Clara and left. The following week, proper benches arrived. They were made of good oak and had been planed smooth, and they fit the room exactly, as though someone had measured the room before making them, which of course someone had. Clara received them with her hands folded and her face composed, and she thanked the men who carried them in, and she told herself once more that she was not going to form conclusions. Then she sat down on one of the new benches in the empty room, in the quiet of the late afternoon, and for one moment only, one brief and private moment, she put her face in her hands. Not because she was sad, because she was not. The 3rd time Clara went to Dunmore, she was not summoned, and she was not going to ask for anything. It was April, and a boy named Thomas Vetch, who was 9 and the cleverest child in the room, had come to school that week with a broken arm badly set, and Clara had spoken to his father about it, and his father had said the marine surgeon was too expensive, and the arm would have to do as it was, and the arm as it was would mean Thomas would never write properly, and Thomas was the kind of child who would build his whole life on writing if someone gave him the chance. Clara walked to Dunmore on a Wednesday afternoon after the children had gone home. She was shown in at the side door as before. She waited less time than before. The Duke came into the small room and sat in the same chair and looked at her with the same careful attention and said, "Miss Ashworth," and she told him about Thomas Vetch and the broken arm and the surgeon in Marin. She told him the child's name and age and the extent of the injury and what would happen to a hand that healed without proper setting. She did not ask directly. She had worked out by now that she did not need to ask directly, that the telling was sufficient, that this was a man who heard what was inside the words as clearly as the words themselves. He was quiet for a moment after she finished, in the way he was always quiet, as though he were finishing some internal calculation. Then he said, "The surgeon in Marin is retained by the estate for the use of the estate's tenants." He said, "Thomas Vetch's family farms 3 fields on the Ashfen edge of the Dunmore land." He said, "I will send word today." The arm was reset that Friday. Clara knew because Thomas came to school the following Monday, with his arm in a proper sling, and said with great self-importance that the Duke's own surgeon had fixed it, and that the surgeon had said it would be right as new by summer. He said it the way 9-year-old boys say things that have impressed them, which is to say, repeatedly and at volume, until the whole room had heard it at least twice. Clara made him spell surgeon on the slate, and the room laughed, and she allowed herself to smile at the board, so that no one saw the full size of it. She went to Dunmore 4 more times that spring and summer. She went for a child whose mother was ill and whose father could not manage. She went for a roof tile that had come off the schoolroom in a storm and let the rain in. She went for paper, which they had run out of entirely, and which arrived in sufficient quantity the following day to last the year. She went once because the lane to the school had washed out, and the smaller children could not cross it safely, and the lane was mended within a week, which was faster than such things were usually mended in Ashford, and everyone in the village noticed the speed of it and drew their own conclusions, none of which they said directly to Clara, because she was Clara, and there were things people did not say to her directly. Each time she went, she was shown in at the side door and waited a shorter interval than before. And the Duke came into the small room and listened, and they talked about the business of the schoolroom, and she left. He never asked her personal questions. She never volunteered personal information. There was a proper formality to it that suited them both, and within that formality there was somehow, by the end of summer, something else, something that existed in the silence between the formal sentences that Clara refused to name because naming it would make it into a thing that could be lost, and she did not want it to be a thing that could be lost. She wanted it to continue exactly as it was, which she knew was not how such things worked. It was the oldest Western girl who said the thing that everyone else had been careful not to say. Her name was Bess, and she was 11, and she had no tact whatsoever, which Clara had always considered one of her finest qualities. She was helping Clara sort the new books one afternoon in September, when she looked up with the particular directness of a child who has been thinking about something for a long time and has finally decided to say it, and said, "Miss Ashworth, why does the Duke pay for everything?" Clara did not look up from the books. She said, "The estate supports the village in various ways, Bess." Bess said, "My father says it wasn't like that before. He says the estate didn't use to bother." Clara said, "Open the 3rd book to page 12 and read me the first paragraph." Bess opened the book and read the paragraph, which she did very well, and did not say anything else about the Duke, and Clara did not say anything else about the Duke, and the afternoon went on in its ordinary way, except that the question sat in the quiet corner of the room, where Clara always put the things she was not going to think about yet, and it sat there more solidly than most of the things in that corner, and she knew by the weight of it that she was going to have to think about it eventually. The thinking arrived in October, on a Tuesday evening, when a man she did not know came to her door and gave her a letter. The letter was from the solicitors in Maron, the same firm that had written to her a year ago about the rent. It was brief and formal, and it said that by instruction of the Duke of Dunmore, a sum had been settled into an account in her name at the Maron Bank, representing her wages for 7 years of teaching in the Ashford schoolroom, calculated at the rate of a qualified schoolteacher in the county, with interest. The figure that followed was large enough that she read it 3 times in the doorway, with the evening coming in cold around her, before she was certain she had read it correctly. She sat down on her own doorstep in the dark, which she would not ordinarily have done, and held the letter in both hands, and did something she had not done since the day they buried her father, which was to cry without making a sound, with her face turned up toward the sky, so the tears ran back rather than down. She cried for a considerable time. She was crying because the money meant Thomas Vetch could go to the grammar school in Marin, which she had been quietly calculating the impossibility of for 3 years. She was crying because 7 years of chalked letters and cold mornings and planks for benches had been seen, had been counted, had been valued at an honest figure by someone with the power to name that figure. She was crying because she had spent 7 years being grateful for weather that did not make itself her enemy, and it turned out the weather had been watching over her deliberately the whole time, and she had not known. She stopped crying when she got cold. She went inside and put the letter on the table and looked at it for a long time by the light of the lamp. Then she put on her coat. She walked to Dunmore in the dark. She had not done this before, and she did not think about whether it was the kind of thing that was done. She had found over the years that thinking about whether a thing was the kind of thing that was done was only useful if you had an alternative to doing it, and she had no alternative to this. The gate was closed but not locked. The drive was dark under the limes, but there was enough moon that she could see. She had the letter in her pocket. She went to the front door this time, not the side door, because this was not business, and it was not a visit she was going to announce in advance to any footman. She knocked. A butler came and looked at her with the expression of a man whose entire professional life has prepared him to deal with unexpected visitors at the front door in the dark, and who is nonetheless somewhat surprised by this one. She said she needed to speak with the Duke. She said it was urgent. She said her name. The butler looked at her for a moment, and then, to his own evident surprise, stood aside and let her in. She waited in a different room this time, a room with a fire and several chairs and a window that looked out onto the dark park, and she sat on the edge of one of the chairs with her coat still on and her hands in her lap, and her heart going at a pace she did not think was reasonable for a woman who had told herself she had no feelings of any particular kind about a duke. He came in after 5 minutes. He was not expecting her, and she could see from the slight alteration in his careful face that he was not expecting her, and then she could see that the alteration shifted into something else, something she might almost have called relief, though she could not have said what he was relieved about. He said, "Miss Ashworth." She stood up. She took the letter from her pocket and held it out to him. She said, "I came to ask you why." He took the letter and looked at it, and then looked at her and said, "I think you know why." She said, "I should like you to say it." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Because the work was worth the wage, and the wage was owed." She said, "That is not all of it." He looked at her steadily. He said, "No, that is not all of it." And then he said the rest of it, which she had not let herself know she was waiting to hear, and which she will not repeat here, because there are things that happen in rooms that belong only to the people in them, and this was one of those things. She stayed at Dunmore until late. She walked home in the dark under the limes, and the moon had moved west, and the fields were very quiet, and she walked the way a person walks when the shape of her life has changed shape again, and she is still adjusting to the new dimensions of it. She had come to Dunmore the first time to ask for help. She had come the second time to give it. She had come this time neither to ask nor to give, but simply because there was a thing that needed to be said between two people who had been circling it for a year with great care and considerable patience, and it had been said, and the world was different on this side of it. The schoolroom at Ashfen opened the following Monday, as it always opened, at 7, with the wool curtain hung aside, and the stove lit against the cold, and the 12 children coming in from the lane, with their faces red from the air. Clara stood at the front, as she always stood, with the chalk in her hand and the slate behind her, and she began where they had left off on Friday. Nobody who came down the lane past the old miller's cottage that morning would have noticed anything different about the woman teaching in the doorless room. She had the same straight back and the same winter water eyes and the same chalk calloused hands, and she taught the same children the same letters in the same cold air. The benches were better than they had been, the books were newer, the stove was warm. There were things it takes years to build, and there are things you build a day at a time without knowing what they will add to. And Clara Ashworth had been building both kinds simultaneously for 7 years, and the morning felt the way mornings feel when you understand for the first time what it is you have been building. By spring, Thomas Vetch had a place at the grammar school in Marin. His mother came to the schoolroom on the last Friday and stood in the doorway with her hands folded and said to Clara, in the plain way of women who do not make speeches, "Thank you." Clara said Thomas had done the work. His mother said, someone showed him the work was worth doing. She left before Clara could answer, which was just as well, because Clara did not have an answer ready and was not going to find one in time. By summer, there were 19 children in the schoolroom, because word had reached 2 farms over the hill that the schoolroom at Ashfen was well supplied and well taught, and that the lane to it was properly mended. Clara wrote to the solicitors in Marin and asked whether there was any provision in the settled sum for the expansion of the schoolroom. She received a reply within 4 days, which was faster than such things were usually handled, and the reply said yes, and named a figure, and Clara sat with the letter at the door table in the quiet of a Thursday afternoon and thought about walls and windows and a proper door, and what it would mean to have a proper door. And she was still sitting there when she heard a step on the lane outside and looked up, and the Duke of Dunmore was standing in the doorway without the wool curtain, which had been moved aside, looking at her, looking at the letter. He said, "I thought I would come to see the room." She said, "You could have sent Mrs. Carr." He said, "Mrs. Carr has seen it." He looked at the room, at the new benches and the large slate and the 6 good books and the stove. He said, "I should have come sooner." She said, "You have been here the whole time." He looked at her. She said, "The benches, the books, the stove, the lane, the surgeon, Thomas Vetch. You have been here the whole time, Your Grace. You simply did not come in." He was quiet. For the length of time he was always quiet, when she had said something that required him to be quiet. Then he said, "I am in now." She said, "Yes." She moved her papers to make room at the door table. He sat down on one of the oak benches, a duke at a child's schoolroom table, with his long coat and his careful face, and his hands folded in front of him, and she sat across from him, and outside the lane was summer, and the fields were long and gold, and the schoolroom had no door, but the air that came through where the door should be was warm for the first time in 7 years, and they talked. They talked for a long time, not about the schoolroom, about everything else. They talked the way 2 people talk when they have been circling each other at a careful distance for a year, and have just this week decided to close it. He was not cold. She had known he was not cold. He was a man who felt things quietly and at some depth, and did not perform the feeling, which she understood better than most people would have, because she was a woman who did the same thing, and when 2 people who do the same thing recognize it in each other, there is a particular kind of ease that does not have to be built, because it is simply already there. The sun moved in the room, and the afternoon went long, and they let it go. At some point, she showed him the letter about the expansion, and they talked about walls and windows, and what a proper door would cost, and he listened, and she spoke, and it was the same as it had always been, and entirely different, and both of them knew it. He walked back to Dunmore in the evening. She stood in the doorway of the schoolroom and watched him go up the lane, and the wool curtain moved in the warm air beside her, and she thought that she would have a door by winter. She thought that there were things you build a day at a time without knowing what they will add to, and then one summer afternoon you are sitting in what you have built, and you understand the whole of it at once, and it is larger than you knew, and it is yours, and you are not going to have to carry it alone any longer. She went back inside and straightened the books on the table, and put out the stove, and took the chalk from the ledge, and put it in her pocket. She did it the way she did everything, which was carefully and without fuss, and she went home in the long summer light, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she had been teaching toward, without knowing she was teaching toward it. Every morning for 7 years. Thank you for listening to this story, all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from and what the story made you feel. Do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next one.